Hello. Welcome to a discussion called Understanding Shakespeare, featuring members of the Royal Shakespeare Company. My name is Jack Carr. I'll be talking with Barry Lynch, Emily Raymond, and Piers Ibbotson, who are associated with the new production of Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream, currently playing at the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts in Washington, D.C. Our discussion will focus on two things: what makes the current production of A Midsummer Night's Dream unique, and what occurred during the production's rehearsals that made that uniqueness possible. Toward the end of the discussion, we'll also talk a bit about careers in the theater and how people get them. Barry Lynch plays two roles in A Midsummer Night's Dream. He appears at the beginning and end of the play as Philostrate, a member of the court in Athens. For the rest of the production, he plays the mischief-making Puck. Emily Raymond plays Helena, a jilted woman who, after a lot of confusion, gets her man back. Piers Ibbotson is the assistant director of the production. He is traveling with the company for its performances in San Francisco, Chicago, Washington, D.C., and New York. Welcome to you all. This production of A Midsummer Night's Dream began 2 years ago in England at the Royal Shakespeare Theatre in Stratford-upon-Avon. Piers, I wonder if, in order for us to see a clip from the show, from one of the early scenes, if you could set it up for us.
We have a clip from this production. The scene we will just have a look at, just to start things off, is the first time that you see Puck and the first fairy, where we move into the enchanted wood part of the play. It happens right after the first scene with the mechanicals. We've just seen Bottom and his friends casting their play that they're going to put on later on. And then in this production, there's a great clap of thunder and a storm, and cloth goes out and we dissolve onto two green umbrellas flying down, and on these come Puck and the first fairy for their first scene together, and that's the clip. So we could have a look at the tape now.
In grove or green, by fountain clear or spangled starlight sheen, but they do square, that all their elves for fear creep into acorn cups and hide them there.
Either I mistake your shape and making quite, or else you are that shrewd and navy sprite called Raymond Goodfellow. Are not you he that frights the maidens of the villagery, skim milk, and sometimes labor in the kern, and bootless make the breathless housewife churn, and sometime make the drink to bear no barm, mislead night wanderers, laughing at their harm. Those that hobgoblin call you, and sweet Puck. You do their work, and they shall have good luck. Are not you he?
Thou speak'st to right, I am that merry wanderer of the night. I jest to Oberon and make him smile when I a fat and bean-fed horse beguile, neighing in likeness of a filly foal. And sometime lurk I in a gossip's bowl in very likeness of a roasted crab, and when she drinks against her lips I bob, and on her withered dewlap pour the ale.
Barry, you've been with this production since it began 2 years ago.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you would talk a little bit about how rehearsals began and how the director, Adrian Noble, got you started.
Right, it's a very long time ago. I don't know if I can remember exactly what happened, but I know that on the first day of rehearsals, Adrian presented us with this model for the set. So we knew that we were going to have light bulbs in the fairy forest, and that I was going to come down with the first fairy on umbrellas. But apart from that, we didn't really have a firm idea of what the fairy world was going to be. So what Adrian did was get us to use whatever was in the room, I suppose, and explore what it might be like to be fairies or in another kind of world, in another kind of reality. We did quite a bit of mask work in the first week. So you would come on wearing a mask and interact with other actors or just one actor, just as, you know, in a particular way to see if anything came out of that.
You were using dialogue from the script. You weren't improvising.
No, we weren't using dialogue from the script at that point. We would say you would come on onto the acting area, if you like, and Adrian or Sue Lefton, the movement woman, might give you instructions as to how you should be, if you know what I mean, whether you were in a good mood or whether you were sad, or what this other person in the room was doing, what you felt about them. And what's interesting about having a mask on is that, of course, you're not using your face, you're using your body, but the people watching project a lot of emotion, not emotion, but expression onto the mask, which is, it's very interesting to watch. It's interesting to do. You know, you don't actually have to do that much. And I suppose what we got from that was that if you believe you are in a particular place, then the audience will go along with you, which is very useful for being in a place like the Fairy Wood. And I think what Adrian wanted to do with having umbrellas and light bulbs is not be literal, not have trees and grass and shrubbery, but to create a place where the actors and the audience both use their imagination.
Mm-hmm. Is it correct to call these exercises that you did?
Yeah, I suppose so.
What would be another example of an exercise that you did in the course of early rehearsals?
Let me think. I can't remember any. Do you know anything that you might have done?
Did you do anything that in the United States we refer to as trust exercises? Where people carry you, perhaps?
Oh, yeah, that's right. We did that. To kind of get the feeling of what it might be like to fly. What we would do is one person would be carried by the whole company, but not just carried through the space. They'd be kind of passed from one person to another, you know, holding them up like that. And so people at the back would go to the front, and there would be a continuous feeling of being passed along by a series of hands, but that you were flying, so that if you felt like going up like that, the people beneath would support you. And that was really interesting. And I think he used it in Titania's entrance. Titania is born on stage by the fairies, and yeah, it was very useful.
Did you and the other fairies go through any kind of process that helped you to establish how you were going to move?
Not specifically. There's a couple of dances, fairy dances, so Sue Lefton was working on the choreography of those and getting the fairies to move in a particular way. But I'm not involved in the dances, so, and in a way I'm Oberon's fairy. The other fairies are all Titania's fairies, so I didn't feel that I had to do exactly what they were doing.
Mm-hmm. What length of time did you have for rehearsal?
I think it was about 8 weeks. 8 weeks, but during that 8 weeks we would all be playing at night in other shows, and we'd be doing matinees on Thursdays and Saturdays, so you wouldn't have 8 weeks of 6 days a week, 3 sessions a day.
I'm sorry, how many hours a day then for rehearsal?
It varied. Say if you were doing a show at night, then you'd have to be finished by 5:30. And if you're doing a matinee on a Thursday or a Saturday, you'd have to be finished by 11:30.
Exhausting.
It can be tiring, but it can also be very stimulating because you're working on 2 or 3 things at the same time. And you know, if you're in good production with a happy company, it can be a great place to work.
When you were rehearsing Midsummer Night's Dream, what were you appearing in at night?
Coriolanus.
So it's a bit of a switch. A bit of a switch.
But it could. See, that's the good thing about working at the RSC. You can do something like Coriolanus, and then the next day you'll be doing Midsummer Night's Dream, and one thing feeds the other, I think.
Do you continue to rehearse now that you are here in this production?
No.
Okay. You know, I think maybe at this point we should ask Piers and Emily a question. You both came into this production about a year ago, yes?
That's right.
Mm.
So Barry had already been at the job for a year, and you came along. What was that like, to come into a production that had already been set?
Well, for me it was quite strange because I was coming into a situation with a group of 4 actors that work very much together, the 4 lovers. And I had probably about a week to come into it and really try and adapt the style of the piece with my own input, of course, but that was my job, which is a different job than starting from the beginning in a rehearsal process where you have a lot more input, I suppose.
Doesn't seem fair. He got 8 weeks, you got 1.
It's not fair at all, is it?
How is it possible for you to do that quickly?
I'd played the part before, about 5 years ago, so I was familiar with the lines, and in fact they came back very quickly. And I think you just adapt to whatever amount of time you've got, really. If you have 8 weeks, or if you have 2 years, as you do in some East European countries, you use that time in whatever way you can. Often 8 weeks can be wasted and 1 week can be very productive. It doesn't necessarily...
Were you doing performances at night?
No, I wasn't.
So you at least had that luxury to go home.
And it was a week that was quite concentrated on what I was doing as well, which again helps.
Yes. Now, when you were at the point of let us say, entry, did you get an opportunity to do the entire show with everyone else before you had to go before an audience?
Yeah. Yes.
Once?
Yeah, we had a run-through in the rehearsal room, which is good. You don't have the pressure of all the technical stuff, and it's just very sort of one-to-one, or rather just the actors in a space. And then we had a technical rehearsal where you can get used to all the technical side of things. It is for the technical people and the actors to a certain extent, but it's a long time. It usually takes about 2 or 3 days to go through and run over all the technical things so that everyone gets it smooth. Yep. And then we had a dress rehearsal, and then the first preview. So, a fair amount of time to get used to everything.
Wasn't awful.
No, not too daunting.
Piers, when you came in as assistant director, what did that mean for you for a production already established?
Well, it is difficult. I mean, obviously it's harder, I think, for somebody coming in to play a role who's not been in on the very first processes. For me, it's a matter of getting to learn the show, how it works, and also trying to pick up as clear a sense as I can get of what the director wants the show to look like. I mean, that's my purpose, is to sort of replace his eye when he's not there, to try and maintain it in a way that would suit his. So you have to abdicate one's own artistic judgment and try and get inside his head and say, I see what he's trying to do here and what this looks like now. And then my job is to try and maintain it in that condition, besides my other duties to do with rehearsing and the understudy company. So it is very difficult when it's set up. You can see what it looks like. You can say, right, I can keep it looking like this. But it is much more difficult if you to then find ways of encouraging the actors to keep it fresh from the inside, because you have to find out what the intentions were, how they arrived at the decisions they've made, and that can be difficult. We had a further rehearsal period before we brought the show to London, and I was able to pick up a lot more then about how the show really works and what Adrian is trying to achieve in scenes, and how the actors themselves had arrived at the creative decisions they've made. And when you've been through that process, then I can help in ways, I hope, to try and keep it fresh and keep people reminded of the first inspiration that made it happen, and that helps to keep the production fresh. But it is very difficult, and I think both of us probably feel the lack of having been there, of having to fit in. But then when the show is running, it changes, and it grows, and new people coming into a production will shift it, and the dynamic between different actors will work differently, and the way in which scenes are achieved gradually evolves and changes, and then you have to monitor those changes to let them happen, obviously, if they're good and creative ones, but also try and keep them within the spirit of Adrian's original intentions.
Well, let's go back a little bit to see if Barry can help us with a little bit more of those original intentions. One of the things that I know many people talk about with regard to this production is the way it looks, with its at least semi-surrealist atmosphere. Could you talk a little bit about how some of that came to be?
Well, as I said, on the first day of rehearsals, we were presented with the light bulbs and the umbrellas as a kind of a theme in the show. So didn't really have any understanding of where that came from. I mean, I can understand where it came from in terms of what sources Anthony and Adrian were drawing on, but we as actors didn't have any input into that. But there was one day when we just rehearsed the Scout Hut and we're moving into the Fairy Wood, and the stage management hadn't removed the door into the Scout Hut, so it was still in the acting area when the Fairy Wood scene started, and it just seemed like a good idea to have a door there. And so the idea of having doors in the forest came from that mistake, if you like. It's actually quite a good idea to have doors in a dream world. But it was an idea that presented itself out of a mistake.
I'm interested in how it is that creative people know how and when to seize on chance and make good use of that chance.
I think Adrian is a good director in the sense that he doesn't come to the rehearsal room with very definite ideas of how he wants a production to be or how he wants you to be as an actor. He very much allows whatever atmosphere is going to develop between people to develop. And I find he wants you to use parts of yourself, you know. He wants you to bring something of you to your part rather than ask him what you think he thinks it's all about. So I think that makes him very open to things that may turn up.
Does it make him something of an editor then?
I suppose so. I think he allows you to fail in rehearsals, so you're not penalised for trying something out if it's terrible, so long as you're keeping to try things out. So yeah, I suppose at the end he says, I like that, and that, and you can throw the rest of it out.
So it's good to fall on your face once in a while.
I think it's essential.
Yeah,
really.
Figure out how you got there and not fall that way again.
Well, I think if you feel free to make mistakes, then you're more likely to explore. You're more likely to take risks in rehearsal. Whereas if you feel that if you get something wrong, the director's going to be worried, well, then it's a restraint on you, isn't it, in rehearsals?
Well, now, here's a question for all three of you that you make me think about. All of that's fine in rehearsal, all that exploration and finding out about what works and what doesn't. What happens when you settle down to do this play for 2 years? Is there any leeway as the performances are going along that you can make adjustments? Or is it all set?
I think there's a leeway in terms of even what mood you're in when you go in to do a show in the evening. I don't mean that you necessarily take that on stage with you, but it might affect something, and if you feel free enough to use that, then you might discover something new or find a different angle into it. It depends what part you're playing as well. I think some parts are more open to that than others. I feel Helena's particularly open to all sorts of kind of interpretations or ways of looking at things.
Mm-hmm. There's a certain constraint in terms of, I mean, just there are lots of things. It's a very technical show. There are lots of machinery going up and down and things flying up and down, and some of it can be dangerous. Doors shooting out of the floor on hydraulic rams and things. And if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, obviously that, to that extent, it must be set safely. And the more complicated a show becomes technically, also in terms of the lighting plot on this show is very detailed, and there are times when the lighting designer has developed an effect which moves across the stage, increasing the lighting to generate an image, and if you cut against that or decide to go somewhere else, you're not going to be lit. I mean, there are constraints like that, obviously, and the more technical a show is, often the tighter those constraints are.
I suppose I mean constraints on your mind.
But
if you can stick within constraints of the technical side of things in terms of where you are standing when things are happening.
I think it's essential that you do, isn't it? Because otherwise, what are you doing? You're just churning out the same old thing for 2 years, and that's not satisfying for anybody.
Yeah.
But also, it's saying that after 6 or 8 weeks of rehearsals, you've arrived at the definitive way of playing a part, and that's ridiculous because you learn most when you're playing it, not in rehearsals.
Let me ask you this then. To what degree do you enjoy rehearsals?
Me personally,
Yes.
I prefer playing than rehearsing.
Playing. Emily?
I think I prefer rehearsing than playing.
Dare I ask you?
Yeah, well,
do you prefer the rehearsal or watching?
Oh, well, actually, yes, I definitely prefer rehearsing, but actually I find watching surprisingly interesting because, I mean, I can't quite believe I do because it seems to be so boring to watch Shane play over and over again. But I'm very aware of exactly the sorts of changes that Emily's talking about and Barry are talking about putting in, and when I see them happening, it's very exciting to see a scene which I've seen, maybe 2 or 3 times already that week. And then, on the Sunday night, somebody has a good idea, and suddenly another colour comes out, or you suddenly a line or a moment is revealed, and you think, now that's great. We haven't seen that before, and that's terribly encouraging, and I find that surprisingly engaging and interesting.
Yeah. Well, you've done Barry. You at least have done the show now about 200 times. Yes. To what degree have audiences influenced any of these interpolations, if you will?
I think it's dangerous if you allow the audience reaction to dictate too much to you as to what you're doing, because, I mean, what are we talking about? We're talking about laughs, really, aren't we, in terms of audience reaction? That's the most tangible aspect of audience reaction that you can plug into very easily. But if you're I mean, the thing is, if you do a play, if you do a dress rehearsal in an empty theatre, it's a completely different experience to doing it in a theatre that's got people in it. The audience are the other dimension to the whole experience of going to a play. They bring it to life in a way. So you do have to learn from them, but not in an obvious way, I think, not just where they laugh. You shouldn't appeal to them. And in a way, the dream, because it's so much to do with the imagination, I think it's easy to play over 200 times because all of us have huge imaginations. It's not too rational. You've got a certain amount of freedom in the dream, I think, which makes it constantly possible to explore different possibilities, if that makes sense.
I think it makes sense. Good. I'd like for us, or for you, to talk a bit about how you approach the text and how you deal with issues of reading the verse. But I think in order to do that, we should see another clip from the production. And I wonder, Piers, if you'd tell us about that.
Yes, this is the part of in the second half of the play. It's the quartet, the 4 lovers, have finally reached their kind of their height of their confusion. Demetrius and Lysander have both been squirted in the eye with magic love juice and are both passionately wooing Helena when Hermia turns up on the scene, finds the 2 men all over Helena, gets frantically jealous and then accuses Helena of having seduced them. So that's the bit we've got to, the height of the confusion in the lovers scene. So perhaps you could see the tape.
How low am I? I am not yet so low, but that my nails can reach unto thine eye! I pray you, oh, you mock me, gentlemen, oh, this not hurt me. I was never cursed. I have no gift at all in shrewishness. I'm a right maid for my cowardice. Let her not strike me. You perhaps may think because she is something lower than myself that I can match her. Lower! Hark! Again! Good Hermia, do not be so bitter with me. I ever more did love you, Hermia. Did ever keep your counsels, never wronged you. Save that in love unto Demetrius, I told him of your stealth unto this wood. He followed you. For love I followed him, but he hath chid me hence and threatened me, to strike me, to spurn me, nay, to kill me too. And now, so you will let me quiet go. To Athens will I bear my folly back and follow you no further.
Well, after that, Emily, could you talk a little bit about how you've approached the text of A Midsummer Night's Dream?
Approach the text. In what sense?
Making meaning of it. Getting at what it means, what it makes you feel.
Well, now, yes, with Shakespeare, it's such a structured text, particularly Midsummer Night's Dream. There are a lot of rhyming couplets, and it's very precise. And I think that there are clues within that on what the text means, not only in looking at what that strange word means, because it's not in use now, but looking at what word is the operative word in the line, what word does the line end with. That's very important. And sometimes if you look at a speech and you just read all the last words in the line of a speech, it can give you clues into what the state of mind of the person is. That's looking at it in quite a technical way. Having understood that and gone through the rhythm of it, or whatever it is that it's a difficult thing to explain, really. I mean, I think people just approach it in different ways, but then I would try and release my emotions more, or myself into the part more, and let go with it more, having defined for myself what it all means.
Do you know, what you're causing me to think about is that to a considerable degree in America, particularly because we don't have the history of doing many of the kinds of plays that you've done for centuries, we have a somewhat preoccupation with something called subtext, the business of finding meaning under the words.
Right.
Does subtext apply at all to Shakespeare?
I think certainly in playing Helena, I think the heart's pretty much on the sleeve, and you say what you mean, you say what is on your mind, and you say it in an extraordinary way because it's written in an extraordinary way. So you don't say, I want a cup of tea. You say, I want a cup of tea because I blah, 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 qualify it with extraordinary language and poetry, so that not only are you involved in it emotionally and mentally and imaginatively, hopefully, in your mind, but there is also another music that is going past the audience ears that makes it other than just the meaning of what you're saying, but an involvement in the language, in the beauty of the language. But all these things have got to be balanced against each other. You can watch actors that are far too involved in the poetry of the language, and you don't really understand what it is that they're saying or what they feel about what they're saying, that it's a presentation of it.
Piers, from your standpoint as a director, do you find that actors that you work with come to what Emily's just talking about in a natural way, or do they need particular help with it?
On the whole, people need to be shown it. I mean, I think that there is an enormous amount of clues and help written into the text, and my own approach, more and more in my own work, not just with the RSC but outside it, is to the way Barry was talking, a bit like the way a mask works, in that. That the text is so rich, and that there is so much in there that if you observe it and work it all out and see what is in there, and then work from the outside in a sense, rather than, I think there's a danger of saying, in this scene I'm obviously really cross in this speech, so I'll do it cross. I mean, that at the crudest sort of level, or you use a sort of Stanislavski and say, well, I'm trying to get this and I want that. So I'll think about that while I'm saying this speech. And I think that approach can lead to missing the detail that's in there and generalizing the text. And I think Shakespeare writes you all of that. If you get behind the words and enjoy each phrase, each image, each moment, and the wit of it, because it's really very artificial. It's very difficult to kind of, I mean, if you were doing a sort of Stanislavski approach to how you'd have to start, if you're thinking of playing a Shakespearean character, what sort of a character am I? Well, I'm somebody who speaks in iambic pentameters and rhyming couplets, which is not a thing that people do. Do you know what I mean? So taking sort of purely, you have to take that on board first, I think, and you have to acknowledge that you're speaking poetry, you're not speaking prose. But exactly as Emily says, there's a terrible danger then it all just becomes about that. But I think, oddly enough, what I've discovered, I think, generally, is that the more attention you pay to the technical structure of the text, the easier it is to play it naturalistically, ironically. It's odd, but it does seem to work that way. If you absolutely religiously notice every pun, every synonym, every way which is balancing one image against another, if you notice your caesura pause and your line endings and you do all of that work, what actually comes out sounds surprisingly, it's much more natural than if you say, well, I'll do this speech cross and then just make a sound with it. And I find that whole process absolutely fascinating. It just intrigues me more than anything else. To work
one of
on
the
that.
things that makes the Royal Shakespeare Company unusual is, as Barry suggested to us earlier, the luxury of an 8-week rehearsal period. Am I correct that there are also other kinds of resources that are available to actors at the RSC that aren't ordinarily available? For instance, someone to help you with speech, someone to help you with movement.
You do have a voice department in Stratford and in London. And the people there are generally experts on speaking verse and also getting you to do exercises to develop your voice, so that you can play Shakespeare in the big theatre there. So if you go to them regularly, I think they can be really, an excellent resource that you can draw on as an actor. Yeah. I think you can learn a lot. One of the other luxuries is that you can play something for a long period of time. So you can discover you can discover the subtleties and intricacies which may not be apparent in the first few weeks of playing.
Yeah. Emily, when you came in a year ago, did you have those resources available to you in just your 1 week of preparation?
Yes, I did, yes.
I
had to work with the voice department during that week, yes.
But you'd already done a previous 2 years season with the company
yes,
anyway.
I've been with the RSC before, not with this production.
Okay. When one comes into the company, is it required that you go for voice lessons?
No.
It's up to you, really.
It's up to you.
Yeah.
Are they offered in a class form or individually?
Well, there is an effort to try and provide in the early first weeks when the new company is starting rehearsals on the new season, to try and provide some company sessions where everybody in the company gets to work on the basis of verse, and that's sometimes led by the voice department, or occasionally John Barton, who comes in and gives a tutorial to the whole company on sonnets. John Barton's has a long history with the company and did a lot of very early work in the 60s and 70s on verse speaking. And so that happens as a company thing. Occasionally a director will have a company voice session or verse session in the course of his rehearsals, but mostly it's done as individual tutorials and people going off to work with individually from members of the voice department.
Well, one of the other things about working on your voice with the voice department is, in a way, you're really working on your acting as well, because your voice expresses so much about your personality that any inhibitions or mannerisms that you have are usually or tensions that you have are manifested in your voice. So if you're doing consistent good work on your voice with people who really can help you, then I think it can have a dramatic effect on your whole approach.
It's a fascinating process.
Do you know, one of the things that fascinates me when I'm visiting with actor friends in New York is it seems to me that somebody is always saying, "Excuse me, I have to go to class." And somebody's off to a dance class or a voice class or a scene class. Is that sort of thing common in England?
I feel that New York is a lot tougher for an actor. That's my feeling. I could be completely wrong because it's very competitive in London as well, but I think it's very competitive in New York, you know.
I think it happens less. I mean, within the RSC, people tend to be working, rehearsing one play, performing another one, attending classes, etc. Within an RSC, there isn't time in the day to get any more in. As a general sort of cultural thing, I think British actors probably do less of that sort of thing than Americans do. Yeah,
Irish actors do even less.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I do.
May we ask if people in the audience have questions they'd like to pose? Can we do that? Yes, don't be bashful.
I'd like to ask, how did y'all get started in the Royal Shakespeare Company?
Well, who was there first?
Oh, I don't know.
You were there first, weren't you?
I probably was. Yes.
Actor.
You were an actor there.
Yes, I was. Yeah. I acted for 10 years before I started directing. My first job with the Royal Shakespeare Company was, actually, it's why I went into the theatre in the first place. I wrote a letter to the casting department at the Royal Shakespeare Company and asked for an open audition, and they offered one to me, which they did. I don't even know if they still do that, but they have an open audition, and the casting department sees people, and I didn't get a job. I went to see them and I didn't get one, and then I was working in London doing bits and pieces, and I kept writing to them, and somebody from the casting department came to see me do something, and then the next time I wrote and said I wouldn't, was there a job going, they offered me a part in Peter Pan as one of the little lost boys. So that's how I got in.
That's interesting because my first contact with the RSC was when I first came to London in 1982, and I met the casting director, and I didn't even get an audition, and she said, really, you should stay in Dublin, which is fair enough, but it's interesting that you shouldn't be put off.
No,
if you don't
absolutely
get in.
You said you kept writing to them.
Yes, oh yes.
Yes.
No, well, it's what I always wanted to do was work for the Royal Shakespeare Company for some strange reason.
Well, I auditioned in the week before the whole season started, a 2-year season, and suddenly they brought me in. The casting department had seen me in something else, and I went for one audition, and then within the next 2 days had about 5 different auditions with different people. It's sort of quite a mad system where about 9 directors have to agree on sharing their actors. It's quite a tall order for them in a way, and difficult to fit into different shows. And about 11 o'clock on a Friday night, I heard that I got it, and I started that Monday. So it was quite an instant
Can I
thing.
do a little follow-up to that question? How is it that you all came into the theatre at all?
Wow.
I'd always done it. I started acting when I was 9 in a youth theatre, a Saturday morning youth theatre, and I never stopped. And I did lots of things, and I went and had a totally other career, which I didn't like very much in the end, and didn't know what to do. And finally thought, okay, I'll go and do this. You've only got one life. But it was I came in quite late.
From age 9?
Professionally, I started very late, but I'd always done it as an amateur and in youth theatre all my life as
Emily?
a hobby.
No, I'd auditioned for lots of colleges when I was about 17, 18, and in London, the big major drama colleges. It's about 5, and I got refused by all of them. And the next year I tried again and got refused by all of them again. And that year I also auditioned for a college in Manchester that I'd heard about and happened to get in there. And that's really what started me off on it.
Okay. One of the things I'm hearing here is persistence. Barry?
Well, I wanted to be an actor, but I had no kind of contact with the theatre. And so it seemed to me that it was like a different world. It was going to be very difficult for me to get into it. But what I did was I got a job as a stagehand in the Gate Theatre in Dublin, and they happened to be auditioning in that summer for a small part in A Streetcar Named Desire. And I went and auditioned, and I got the part. And it was a nice part because you have a scene with Blanche on her own. So
you're the newspaper boy.
I was the newspaper boy, and I remind her of her husband who died years ago, and she shares a cigarette and kisses him at the end, and so it's a good little scene. And I just happened to be lucky to keep working from then on, more or less, you know.
Okay. Thank you for that. That's interesting information. Other questions?
Do you prefer the modernized Shakespeare compared to the traditional?
Well, I don't think that this production is particularly... In the text hasn't been modernized in any way. It's Shakespeare's language that we're speaking. And you've got to remember that in the 1600s when, say, for instance, Shakespeare's company did Julius Caesar, they were doing it in modern dress. They were doing it in Elizabethan costumes with an old sheet or something to represent a toga. So there's a long tradition of doing Shakespeare in modern dress, for want of a better expression.
Yes,
I think
it's very odd. Do you mean by modern? Do you mean the modern text or
no, the
style and design?
Style.
Yeah, I find this baffling. This question comes up all the time. That people seem to have an idea, and I went to the Folger Library the other day, and I think I know where it comes from. Is that it's full of Victorian pictures and prints of people, of photographs of old sort of prints of productions where Victorians are all dressed up in lovely Elizabethan ruffs and things, doing it in an Elizabethan Elizabethan dress. And so far as I know, that is the only time, apart from when the plays were first performed, when it wasn't Elizabethan dress, it was everyday clothes, that they've ever been done that way. I mean, before and since, people did them in whatever they happened to wear at the time. They did in the 17th century, they did in the early 19th century, they played them in ordinary clothes, and again now we're playing them in contemporary clothes. It's an odd notion. I mean, of course one can do it like that, and it's very good and useful for certain sorts of productions, and it says something. But I mean, I really do think it's much more interesting to try and make the play, to rip it about a bit and try and make it a way in which it's going to reach anybody who can walk into the theatre, will go, I recognise this. It makes you think about it in a way that if it looks like these kind of old-fashioned productions, you don't kind of have to take it seriously as a piece of theatre. It becomes a piece of, revivalism, or it's Shakespeare. It isn't Shakespeare. It's a play. Things happen to people in it.
A lot of productions, though, unless you have an in-depth knowledge of the history of fashion, you wouldn't know that it isn't either Elizabethan or whenever it is. You either think that's old-fashioned dress or it's modern dress. Either people are wearing tights and boots and all that sort of thing, or they're not. And if they're not, sometimes it is easier for people that don't know the play to relate more easily to the people on the stage if they're wearing jeans and a T-shirt, for example. It's not necessarily better or worse, but I think that's often why people do that, is to set it in New York in the 1930s, or something that we can identify more with now as a modern audience.
Do you get a lot of commentary about the way this production looks?
Yeah.
What do people say?
Well, a lot of the reviewers have just sort of described it. They've spent a lot of time describing what people wear and that it's strange. I'm not sure whether the people like it or not.
Did you like it? I like it. I like the design. I think it's. I think it makes you use your imagination and makes you think about a real dream world.
Yes,
personally. But I mean, people have different tastes, don't they?
Yes, that umbrella. All the umbrellas, but that magical pink umbrella that comes down as Titania's bower is just and when it tilts and you see all the silk or satin inside, it's
what they wanted to do. Actually, I've just remembered at the end of the Mechanicals' first scene in the Scout Hut, where they're rehearsing their play. At the end of that scene, there's a rainstorm effect, and then the backcloth flies out, and you see the fairy wood. But what Adrian wanted to happen was, he wanted somebody to be walking by with an umbrella, and for the umbrella to be whipped out of their hand by the wind, a green umbrella. And then the screen goes up, and you see Puck and the first fairy come down on green umbrellas. Technically, it wasn't possible, but that's where that idea came from.
Lovely idea.
Good idea.
Yeah.
It's that.
Other questions?
Well, I was wondering how you kept your performances energetic after you said a few hundred times that you did that.
No idea.
None at all.
Well, I suppose, you know, it's not that difficult, really.
But suppose it's a rainy Thursday and you have a headache. How do you manage that?
Well, I mean, it's what you do, isn't it? It's what you do, and so it's not a question of. It's not like I think when you first start acting, you first start performing. It is strange that you've got to be able to do it every night, and on matinees. But once that's what you do, then it's a different thing.
Is the word discipline correct here?
Not really. I don't think it's a matter of discipline. I think it's more, you know, if you love what you do, I think you're very fortunate, and it's not difficult to plug into something about it that you enjoy, even on a day when you don't particularly feel like it. I mean, do you think that makes sense, or is that?
I think there's a lot to do with the fact that you've got a live audience out there, and you get an incredible amount of energy from an audience, and even if you're feeling dreadful, they make a sort of irresistible demand somehow, and however lousy you're feeling, when you stand out there and there they all are, you know, you've sort of you've sort of got to kind of entertain them, you know?
Well, that certainly doesn't energize you then when they're snoozing.
No, that's difficult.
Yeah. Do you sometimes look out into the audience and see someone snoozing?
You can in Stratford very easily. You can see people looking through their programs when you come on to see who you are. You know, every time somebody comes on, there's a rustle of programs and people reading the script in the front.
Yeah, sometimes people follow the text all the time.
Right in the first row, I hear sometimes. Yeah. And that must be, I would guess, disconcerting.
You start to worry if you've put a few lines in that shouldn't be there.
Does anyone ever look at you in a reprimanding way when they have the text?
I don't think we notice them to that detail.
It's interesting, when the first season that I worked at the RSC, I did a few plays in the Swan, and in one play I had a few soliloquies. And
the Swan is a small...
Swan is a small theatre, and you can really see everybody quite distinctly. And I had a few soliloquies, and I used to take it really personally if people were coughing or shifting around, and I'd stop and look at them, which you really shouldn't do.
Actually, I think it's a very good idea. Do you know, I saw a production of Julius Caesar in Stratford maybe 10 years ago at a matinee, a student matinee, at which the actor carrying the moment stopped the performance and spoke very pointedly to the audience about their behavior.
Well, I don't think that's a good idea.
It was
it may have shut them up, but I don't.
I think that's a bad thing.
That.
I don't think you can do that. Well, it's not their fault that you're so boring they've gone to sleep.
But it's not that you're boring. No.
I mean, I don't buy that at all.
That you're boring. They may just not be interested for some reason.
Well, if they're quietly asleep and they're not interested, that's fine. They've paid their ticket money.
No, these people were not quietly asleep.
Even if they're being disruptive, you can't win if you break that. Because I was in a production of Julius Caesar, and the same thing was happening time and time again, that people were eating sweets and coughing and having a laugh with their friends. And one of the guys did stop the show a few times and said, you know, like there was a girl coughing, and he said, haven't you got any cough sweets? Do you want me to get you a drink of water? But you can't win when you do that, really.
No, I think...
No, well, what you're
just
saying...
have to put up with it, don't you?
It was quite an amazing experience, because this actor said, and if there is one more sound from you, we will leave the stage. Well, you know what they heard. They heard a lot of noise. I mean, he was being defied.
Yes.
But they had to go on.
Well, I mean, you do have to go on. That's right. You just go on there, and if they actually start throwing things and drive you off the stage, then you have to give up. But I don't think you should stop.
There'll always be somebody out there who's watching.
There'll always be somebody who's watching, and there will always be somebody who's bored to tears or asleep or doesn't want to be there.
People aren't throwing eggs
audience,
or oranges or things like that at you.
They haven't done it... Well, I don't know. They have actually thrown things at the stage in Stratford.
Well, that used to be a very common thing here in American vaudeville, that if the people didn't like the performers, they threw whatever they happened to have in hand. Glad to hear it's not happening to you. Are there other questions?
I was wondering, do you have to be from the United Kingdom to be in the Royal Shakespeare Company?
Well, I'm Irish, so that answers your question.
I have another one. Have there ever been like Americans in it that you know of?
Yeah, well, I mean, there was a guy last season called Robbie Bowman who's from Washington State, and he was playing some really good parts.
And Billy Brown's Australian.
Do you count Patti LuPone's appearance in Les Miserables?
Yes, I suppose so. I don't know. Les Miserables doesn't feel much like the Royal Shakespeare Company anymore after all this time, but it is. Yeah.
What is the meaning of, is the term artistic associate of the Royal Shakespeare Company? I noticed that, or something like that written next to some people's names. What does that mean?
I think that applies to artists who have had a long association with the company and have frequently performed there. And there are also associate directors who regularly direct. It's
like an informal association, and I think the company feel that it's an acknowledgement that they would like to have a working relationship with those people, but there's no tie on either side.
So it is perfectly possible for someone to come in and just do one show.
Oh, yes.
Other questions?
I have a question. When I'm noticing this production of Midsummer Night's Dream, I noticed that there are actually quite a lot of sexual innuendos, and I know that the text is full of that, but I was rather surprised at how blatantly you expressed that on stage. I was wondering if you were all comfortable in doing that, or was that just a matter of your interpretation of this production?
I don't know anything about sexual.
He's Irish.
Well, he's also playing Puck, and I mean that's absolutely to do with Puck's character.
But it's also in the play. You know, in the play, Oberon and Titania accuse each other of having sexual liaisons with mortals, don't they? And it seems to me, Titania and Bottom have they definitely have some intimate contact. I mean, I don't know to what extent it is in the text, but there's definitely something going on there. So it seems to me that part of the fairy world is that in our imaginations that we normally suppress. You know, people become liberated when they get into the forest in Shakespeare's plays.
Other thoughts on that subject?
No, that's about it, really.
Well, I mean, there isn't, sexual innuendo.
This is looking awfully painful to you.
No,
Piers.
I'm just... It sort of doesn't strike me as particularly... Innuendo is what I'm puzzling at.
There's no innuendo.
There isn't any innuendo. The text is actually quite open and funny and makes jags about it, you know, and talks freely about people wanting one another and falling passionately for one another and wanting to twine their arms around one another, and there's a lot of talk of that sort in the text, and then really all we do is do that, and so.
I presume you mean things like the umbrella going up at the end, or when it's quite clear what they're doing with the umbrella. I mean, that is
the umbrella at the end, I suppose, is absolutely a choice, and we have debated long and hard about it. And for every time we restage the show somewhere else, we always, you know, Adrian sits in the stalls and goes, "Is that too much or not? What do you think? Is it too? Should we? I don't know. What do you think?" And we try and fine it so that it's not too much, and then we tried doing it without it at all, and it just didn't seem to be. I mean, it's where the scene seems to be leading. Come on, you know, and it seems so disappointing not to have some kind of consummation of the scene at the end of it. But it is that's a fine matter. That's a matter of judgment and taste. Perhaps we err a little on the.
All right.
Frisky
We have
side,
time for
I
one
don't
more
know.
question.
Yes. You said that you did Streetcar Named Desire, and I assume everyone's done more recent things than that even. How do you compare Shakespeare to it, and how do you like Shakespeare more, or things like
Modern text.
What do you think, Emily?
Oh, I don't know. I'd love to do something in a space this size with lots of swearing and modern clothes. without having to raise my voice beyond this. It would be wonderful, but I love the classics as well, and Shakespeare in particular. Yeah. Genius.
Yeah, I don't think that I can say I prefer one to the other. You know, if you're working on a good play and you've got a good part, then you're going to get something out of it.
Okay.
Something from it.
There is, you have all just been involved in the making of a feature film of A Midsummer Night's Dream. When is it going to be released?
That's the question I don't think anybody knows.
Not sure.
Adrian's still editing it at the moment, and I don't know, but I guess it'll be released sometime late in the summer, I would think.
So we can look forward
That
to
would be a
it
guess.
coming before the year is up, perhaps?
I hope so.
And thinking about Academy Awards for this time next year.
That kind of thing, yes, certainly.
Good, and we hope that Barry and Emily get them.
It'll cost you more when we come back next time.
We'll pay it. We'll pay it. We'll pay it. Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you all for coming. On behalf of the Kennedy Center and the Prince William Network, I would like to thank Barry Lynch, Emily Raymond, and Piers Ibbotson for joining us in this discussion today, and I want to thank the audience for its own splendid participation and for the good questions. I would also like to thank, particularly here at Hylton High School, the drama teacher, Julie Clark, who prepared these young people and with whom they've been studying the play. We're delighted that you came. For everybody here in the studio and those of you watching on television, I'd like to invite you to tune in again on March 26th from 11 to 12 noon, when Dr. Billy Taylor will present a program entitled Young Jazz and the Young Performer. For those of you with internet access, you may get additional information and ask questions at the Arts Edge website at http://artsedge.kennedy-center.org. Thank you for joining us. Goodbye.